Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today, I'm looking at two of my least favorite personalities in the world. There's Ben, Sell Your Houses to Aquaman Shapiro.
So let's say, for the sake of argument, that all of the water levels around the world rise by let's say 5 feet over the next 100 years, say 10 feet by the next 100 years, and it puts all the low-lying areas on the coast underwater, right? Which, let's say all of that happens. You think that people aren't going to just sell their homes and move?
Just one small problem. Sell their houses to who, Ben? Fucking Aquaman!
And William Lowbar Bill Craig.
Far from raising the bar or the epistemic standard that Christianity must meet to be believed, I lower it.
Thankfully, Ben doesn't really say anything after asking the initial question, so we don't really have to deal with him. This is also hopefully going to be a bit of a shorter video, as I'm trying to get ahead a bit so I can actually do fun things with the kids this summer instead of spending all day every day stuck in my dark, dingy office while everyone else goes out and gets fresh air.
Well, one of the things I think that's happened in the religious community is you see people who are brought up in religious homes and they're taught the stories of the Bible. They're never taught any deeper philosophy or theology that attaches to that. So they have sort of a children's eyes view of what God is and how to think about God. You sort of think of God still as the old man in the sky who's controlling things.
Surprisingly, I actually kind of agree with Ben here. Now, obviously, I disagree with the assumption that the Bible is actually describing a real being who really exists when it comes to God, but with the Old Testament in particular, there is a very rich history of interpretation and debate about interpretation within the Jewish literature. In fact, rabbinic tradition typically held to the opinion that the ability to find new interpretations in texts is what makes them living texts. When you could no longer find a new interpretation, it is now a dead text. So a study of different ways the various books of the Tanakh have been interpreted over the centuries could be a fascinating endeavor. But most modern Christians are fairly insistent that there is only one correct way to interpret the Bible, and it just so happens to be the one that they personally favor, despite the thousands of denominations of Christianity that would disagree with them, not to mention all the different sects of Judaism. Now, I want to say that Ben, being Jewish, probably has a bit more experience with alternate interpretations, but it's difficult to figure out with Ben what his honest beliefs are and what he's saying because he knows it'll get him exposure. Like, I'm pretty sure that he is legitimately an idiot, but he's a media-savvy idiot who knows how to go viral. You'll never convince me that he didn't know before doing it that the deadpan reading to the lyrics of WAP wouldn't go viral.
Whores in this house. There's some whores in this house. There's some whores in this house. There's some whores in this house. Hold up. I said certified freak 7 days a week. Wet ass P-word. Make that pullout game weak.
See? I know why he did it, and I still can't resist playing that clip because it's so goddamn funny. And I'm still 50-50 on whether or not his admission that his wife told him a vagina is a sign of disease was just him being an idiot, or if he was doing it intentionally to go viral again.
What in your opinion is the most reasonable proof of God? What have you found to be the most convincing proof of God's existence?
This is a question that atheists will sometimes get as well. Now, obviously, as an atheist, I don't think that any arguments for God are compelling, but which one comes the closest? And honestly, I kinda hate it when this gets directed at atheists. It'd be similar to asking a mathematician which answer to 2 + 2 that isn't 4 do you think is the best answer. But if I had to choose one, I'd go with the moral argument. Not because I'd find it compelling or convincing in the slightest, but because of its nature as an argument from consequences. Most other arguments from God, when you boil them down to their constituent parts, wind up being arguments from ignorance. I don't know how the universe began, so God did it. I don't know how life began, so God did it. I don't know why consciousness exists, so God gave it to us. That sort of thing. But the moral argument instead goes with, wouldn't it be nice if you could be sure that everyone on the planet had the same moral code and that their moral code agreed with yours? And yes, given that option, I would like everybody to have a moral code that matches up with mine, because I happen to think that mine is a pretty good one. Though I am willing to concede that I am sometimes wrong about things, so being exactly the same would likely be suboptimal. But I can see the appeal. All that said, emotionally resonating with a conclusion that you would prefer is not a reason to actually believe that conclusion to be true.
That God loved me. He loved Bill Craig. And that I could come to know him and experience eternal life with God I thought to myself, and I'm not kidding, I thought, if there is just one chance in a million that this is true, it's worth believing.
I emotionally resonate with the conclusion that the next time I log into my bank account, I will find a legitimate deposit for $10 million waiting for me. But despite my really wanting that to be true on a deeply emotional level, I have no good reason to think that it would be the case. Well, shit. Negative 700 in my account right now. That's fun. So as it turns out, reality did not bend to my personal desires, so I'll have to continue asking you guys to go to patreon.com/ViceRhino in order to feed my children. Hell, if one of you happens to be a high roller and pledges $10 million, then I solemnly swear that I'll only charge it once, and then I'll never ask for Patreon pledges again. And I showed you both my hands during that whole thing, so you can see I don't have my fingers crossed. Toes, though. Gotta watch out for those guys. Again, though, as much as I would really like to believe that one of you will do that, the reality of the situation is that the vast majority of you don't have anywhere near the disposable income required to hand someone that kind of cash, and by vast majority, I probably mean all of you.
Well, I think that those are two questions. For me, my favorite argument for the existence of God that I find the most compelling is a version of the cosmological argument.
Yeah, we know, that's kind of your whole thing.
Say the line, Bart!
The cosmological argument.
Yay!
It's too bad, really, that Sean Carroll kicked your ass in that debate about cosmology.
Which goes like this. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. Something can't just come into being from nothing. Secondly, the universe began to exist. I think we have both good philosophical arguments and scientific evidence for the finitude of the past, from which it follows, third, therefore the universe has a cause.
Congratulations, you watered down the cosmological argument so far that you got us to a cause for the universe. If I grant everything about this argument, it doesn't indicate a god, just a cause. Sure, you like to think that God is that cause, but that's not actually indicated by the argument. But this one is fun because not only is it an argument from ignorance, we don't know what caused the universe, therefore God, but Craig's version of it also makes use of the fallacy of composition, where one assumes that the parts of a whole have the same properties as the whole. So in this case, everything we have observed within the universe is a part of the universe. Craig is treating these parts of the universe as though they would obviously have the same properties as the universe as a whole. In this case, the property of contingency, where the existence of anything is contingent on previous causes. Things within the universe have this property, so the universe as a whole must also have this property, according to the cosmological argument. And that's if I ignore the equivocation that's going on with the phrase begins to exist. In the first part of the argument, anything that begins to exist has a cause, begins to exist is being used in the sense where materials that already exist are reconfigured to become something new. But when it pivots to the universe beginning to exist, then suddenly we're talking about bringing something into existence without involving materials that already existed. At least that's my understanding of Craig's position. There are certainly cosmological models that don't behave this way, but this is where the unknown comes in. We don't actually know what came before the Big Bang at this time. We have several ideas, but none are conclusive. So ultimately, this whole argument, if I grant everything and ignore the fallacies and equivocation going on, it gets us to, we don't know what came before the Big Bang, therefore God caused the Big Bang. Forgive me, but I just don't find that compelling in the slightest.
And when you do a conceptual analysis of what it is to be a cause of the universe, you arrive at a being which is an uncaused, beginningless, timeless, spaceless, enormously powerful, personal creator of the universe.
You really don't, though. This is a point that Craig usually just brushes past without spending too much time on it. He will endlessly pontificate about how the Guth-Vilenkin theorem proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that the universe had a beginning in exactly the way that he needs it to in order for this to work, all while ignoring the fact that cosmologists, such as Vilenkin of, Guth-Vilenkin theorem fame, will tell you flat out that the universe could plausibly spontaneously form out of nothing.
So quantum mechanics allows a spontaneous nucleation, you could say, of a closed universe out of nothing, where by nothing I mean a state which has not only no matter, but also no space and no time.
And while he usually does brush past this part, in this interview he's brushing past it with less clarification than normal, so let's go temporarily to an older video of his.
It must be uncaused because we've seen there cannot be an infinite regress of causes. So we must come to an absolutely first, uncaused cause.
Even if I grant this, what is your justification for God being the first cause? The whole point of the Kalam version of the cosmological argument is to avoid the special pleading necessary with the non-Kalam versions. The Kalam is specifically the version that added the caveat of whatever begins to exist to the argument. The whole purpose of that caveat is to avoid the special pleading necessary in order to make that cause God. Without it, we get to ask the question, what caused God? Because everything needs a cause, and presumably, God is part of everything. But if you say that it's only things that begin to exist that need causes, then you get to wiggle out of it by saying that God didn't begin to exist, and then laugh at anyone who is stupid enough to think that what caused God is a reasonable question.
This question, who created God, or all right, what is God's cause? I've heard so many college sophomores ask this question as though this is the sort of knockdown argument that destroys theism. And it's just based on a misunderstanding.
This, of course, just leaves us with the question of, well, what if the universe is the thing that didn't begin to exist? And with my admittedly limited understanding of cosmology, this is a valid question. There are many cosmological models that don't involve a beginning in the sense that the cosmological argument requires. The Carroll-Chen model posits that our perception of time is essentially caused by increasing entropy, but at a point in the past, the direction in which entropy increased reversed, effectively making the universe both appear to have a beginning in the Big Bang and being functionally eternal, with the two arrows of time traveling eternally in opposite directions. The Hartle-Hawking no-boundary proposal is essentially the idea that space-time, when looking at the quantum scales that would have been dominant in the earliest stages of the universe, the Planck epoch, doesn't behave in the same way as we observe it today. Time itself ceases to be a meaningful concept, leaving us in a scenario where there is space but no time, which gets us to a sort of have your cake and eat it too scenario that seems absurd when dealing with scales that we intuitively understand, but which happens all the time in quantum physics. So we have space and no time. Time begins, so now we have space-time. So how long has space existed? For all of time, which has been around for about 13.7 billion years. So space is eternal, in the sense that it has been around since before the beginning of time, in as much as before and beginning are even coherent concepts when there is no time. But at the same time, the universe also gets a beginning. There are also bouncing cosmology models where the universe ends by compacting back into itself before bouncing back into a new universe, a process that, according to some models, could happen an infinite number of times with slightly different properties for each universe that results from each bounce. Also, keep in mind, I am no cosmologist, and reading scientific papers is hard even in areas that I am familiar with. The cosmology papers are next level, though. They are chock full of super specific technical jargon, mathematical equations that are way beyond me, and apparently simple terminology which ends up being super specific technical jargon when used in the context of cosmology or quantum theory, thus changing its meaning to something that I probably don't understand. And the same is true of William Lane Craig. He might be good at using a lot of technical jargon, but when you ask the actual cosmologists that he cites as supporting his argument, they nearly always disagree with his interpretation of their work. The difference between him and me is that I've got enough humility to know when I'm in over my head, and so I'm willing to defer to people who actually know what the heck they're talking about. And then on top of all of these caveats, there's the fact that both myself and Craig have been talking about these models as though they are singular entities. This is the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem described by Born, Guth, and Vilenkin. This is the Hartle-Hawking no-boundary proposal as described by Hartle and Hawking. This is the Carroll-Chen spontaneous inflation model described by Carroll and Chen. But that's not really how it is. The models interact with each other, using discoveries from one to make progress in the development of another, with an ever-growing bush of dependencies. If string theory is true, then this category of models here are all false, and these ones over here are all potentially still true. But flip it if string theory ends up being false. So as much as I'll say the Hartle-Hawking no-boundary proposal holds that time gives way to space, giving us a finite eternity to work with, there are downstream variations of that proposal for which that may or may not be true, depending on how they interact with a plethora of other proposals. And in some cases, the universe has a beginning. In others, it does not. What is the truth of the matter? We don't actually know. Most likely, not a single model that we have developed at this point in history is the one that actually perfectly describes what happened before the Big Bang, which means that any assertions that Craig makes about the nature of the origin of the universe are, at best, an argument from ignorance coupled with his intuition-based preferences.
It must be timeless and therefore changeless, at least without the universe, because it created time.
See, now that doesn't even make sense internally. It has to be timeless, which he admits includes the property of changelessness. It never changes. Well, the act of creating is an act of change. There was no time, then something changed, and now there is. So God either changes, meaning that he didn't create time but is instead subject to it, or he doesn't change, and so nothing exists except for him.
Because it also created space, it must transcend space as well, and therefore be immaterial, not physical.
Why, though? Using your earlier equivocation against you, if begins to exist means, within the universe, rearranging existing material to become something new, then every time a couple have a baby, they have created a human being. But do these humans transcend humanity? Does a single-celled organism that is capable of reproducing by dividing transcend single-celled organismhood? Does a match transcend the fire that it starts? This seems to me like another use of superficial intuition in order to arrive at a conclusion that you like. It sounds right, and I'm sure apologists will be fond of analogies like the potter transcending the pottery that they make in order for it to be more comfortable with our intuitions, but it's just not a statement that actually seems to operate as a universal truth the way that Craig needs it to. But hey, as long as we're being superficial with our intuitions, what do you call a being that doesn't exist anywhere at any time and is completely immaterial? Non-existent. Ergo, if God is as Craig has just described him, then he doesn't exist.
Moreover, I would argue this cause must also plausibly be personal. For ask yourself, how else could a timeless cause give rise to a temporal effect with a beginning, like the universe?
It would have to make a change, which according to your earlier definition of a timeless being, ceases to make it timeless.
If the cause were just a mechanically operating set of necessary and sufficient conditions, then the cause could never exist without its effect. Once the sufficient conditions are given, then the effect must be given as well.
Not according to quantum physics. Hell, the cause doesn't even need to precede the effect in quantum physics, so the infinite regress problem just goes away, as a sufficient cause could happen simultaneously to its effect, thus kickstarting the universe without the need of a transcendent personal cause. So yeah, that was the fleshed out reasoning that he usually uses to get from the universe has a cause to, and that cause is specifically the version of the Christian God that I personally believe in. But it's so weak that even if I grant that, it doesn't get you past deism. If I grant that the cause was a personal God, with Craig's definition of personal seeming to mean capable of making decisions rather than intervenes in the lives of human beings at the personal level, then we still only get to a vague being who decided to create the universe for unknown reasons with unknown methods. So not only is that an overreach, with the argument not even coming close to indicating anything of the sort, but even if I grant that overreach, we're still light years away from anything approaching the version of the Christian or Jewish God. And hell, let's just throw the Islamic God in there as well. Keep the Abrahamic faiths together, since they are technically the same God, even if the God each group describes is functionally very different. Weird that the all-powerful creator of the universe who is personal enough to care about your immortal soul can't be bothered to keep the people that he supposedly directly revealed himself to united.
So for me, that is a very convincing argument for God.
Yeah, we know. You won't shut up about it, even when the physicists whose names you use to support it have told you that you've misunderstood their model.
But I find that with university students, that's not the most convincing argument. You can ignore philosophical arguments for the finitude of the past or scientific evidence for the beginning of the universe.
Now, you don't have to ignore it. You just have to be comfortable with "I don't know" as an answer, because that often is the honest answer about these difficult cosmological questions. Craig being willing to arrogantly declare that he knows the answer because he studies philosophy does not actually make him correct. It just makes him a pompous ass.
But the argument that they find, I think, the most compelling is what I call the moral argument.
See, now there's some of that pomposity right there. This is a very minor nitpick that I wouldn't even bother mentioning with anybody else, but Craig prides himself with his ability to choose his words very carefully and thoughtfully. He just said that the most effective argument for college students is the one that he calls the moral argument, as though he had any say whatsoever in the naming of an argument that has its roots in ancient Greek philosophy that is older than Christianity itself. I don't think that was him misspeaking. Like I said, he chooses his words very carefully, and I think that he chose those words to inflate his own image, making it seem like he is a philosophical pioneer, breaking new ground with his important philosophical work, rather than just being the guy who got famous when he put an ancient Islamic argument for God in modern terms, and then spent the next 45 years repeating it ad nauseum, with the addition of a couple fancy-sounding terms from theoretical physics like Boltzmann brain when he thinks it might help him. Like, seriously, I usually avoid Craig's videos because it takes a lot of effort to figure out what he's even saying, and then after all that effort, it turns out that he really wasn't saying much of anything. But eventually I realized that he's only got a handful of routine shticks, into which he'll occasionally pepper other standard apologetics in order to make them seem fresh.
And it would go like this. 1, if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist.
And right from the first premise, I take issue both with the very idea that objective moral values and duties in the sense that he means exist, and with the assertion that such moral values and duties would not exist without a God.
That is to say, in the absence of God, everything becomes socioculturally relative.
And since morality appears to act in a socioculturally relative fashion, that would seem to indicate that premise 1 is flawed.
2, but objective moral values and duties do exist. There are some moral absolutes, some objective values and duties.
Disagree. I'm sure he's going to bring up something like murder, to which most people will have a visceral, of course it's wrong reaction. But remember, he's talking about objective morals here. Something is objective if it is true irrespective of any subjects. But if there are no subjects, no beings capable of having moral opinions, then murder is wrong ceases to be a coherent statement, as there are no moral agents to which this could even possibly apply. And that includes God. God is a moral agent in this sense. If God's non-existence would cause morality to also not exist, then even if God gives us our morals, morality is still subjective. It's just God that is the subject. God's moral opinions win because might makes right, no other reason. Apologists try to weasel out of this one by saying that God's nature is where we get morality from, and this somehow doesn't count as being God's opinion on morality, but that seems to me to be a distinction without a difference. If God cannot go against his nature, then God is subject to his nature, so morality is still subjective, and if the subject of God disappeared, morality would also disappear.
3, therefore God exists.
Well, given the sorry state of 1 and 2, I'm gonna go ahead and say that 3 is irrelevant. We didn't even get there. I think that was the most Canadian pronunciation of sorry that I've ever done. Just kind of slipped out. Sorry.
Now, this is an argument which is impossible, I think, to ignore, because every day you get up, you answer by how you treat other people, whether you regard them as having intrinsic moral value.
Respecting other people out of subjective moral intuitions coupled with empathy does not speak to the existence of objective moral values and duties being externally imposed on us.
Or whether they are mere means to be used for your ends.
Wow. It always amazes me what a bleak view of humanity apologists have. Like, the only 2 possible options are that objective moral values and duties exist, and therefore God exists, or everyone is a sociopath. That's it for this one. Apparently this was such a condensed version of the argument that we didn't even get a perfunctory murder is bad thrown in there, as though the same people appealing to our universal moral intuitions can't be found defending things like slavery and genocide as soon as you bring up the relevant Bible passages.
It was actually a tremendous blessing to these children for them to be killed and go to heaven and be with God.
My moral intuitions say that killing children for any reason is wrong. But Craig would have me ditch my moral intuition, supposedly given to me by God, the source of objective moral values and duties, because he has to defend the heinous and immoral actions of the God that he claims is the source of morality. At this point, even if the moral argument is actually both valid and sound, the squirming that apologists have to do in order to defend their God's immorality is proof that the God the moral argument points to is not the Christian one. That's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Greg Wasserman2635, who says, "Non-avian dinosaurs is so cringe and unnecessary. We all know what birds are and we all know what dinosaurs are. We know that modern birds arose from a certain clade of dinosaurs and that they didn't go extinct at the end of the Mesozoic. We don't need to say things like non-mammalian therapsids or non-crocodilian archosaurs." Couple things here. First, I'm inclined to agree. Well, it is a neat bit of trivia that modern birds are in fact dinosaurs, and not just in the cladistic nothing outgrows its ancestry sense, but in the very real they are actually all theropods sense. But the thing is, if you go back to my older videos before I started using the qualifier non-avian, you will always find a bunch of comments correcting me on that fact. But yours is the first that I recall ever seeing that is pushing for the correction in the other direction. To be fair, it might actually be better for my channel if I hadn't caved to the pressure there, as more comments equals more engagement, so maybe I'll go ahead and run with that in the future? But either way, having pedantic tendencies myself, I tend to do things to appease the pedants before they get a chance to comment, so that's why I've been doing that up to this point. As to the non-mammalian therapsids or the non-crocodilian archosaurs, firstly, fuck you for making me say archosaur. I go out of my way to avoid it because I don't know whether the CH is supposed to be soft or hard, and Googling it gives me both answers. But always from a robot voice that can't pronounce basic other sounds in the word properly, leaving me to question whether the part that I was unsure about is accurate. Second, people are way more likely to be talking about dinosaurs and birds in everyday conversation rather than therapsids or archosaurs, so it's more relevant. Honestly, the most likely reason there will be that I will ever talk about therapsids is when engaging in unnecessary pedantry myself to point out that Dimetrodon wasn't a dinosaur and is more closely related to mammals than to the other dinosaurs. Before I close out for today, just a minor correction from last week's video. I said that Mount Everest was 6 kilometers tall, when it is in fact just about 9 kilometers tall. I'm not sure how I got 6. It may have been a typo that I just didn't catch while recording or editing. It may have been a brain fart as I tried to remember the number while typing it. It may be that I just chose the first thing I saw on Google for the number, and didn't check closely where it was from, as it was such an inconsequential part of the video. Whatever happened, I fucked up the number, and while it doesn't impact my overall point, which was that creationist geologist John Baumgartner calculated that the heat released by tectonic activity during Noah's flood would have been enough to vaporize water from the Earth's surface to a depth of 25 kilometers, which is much more than would have been present during the flood even if we say the water had to be deep enough to cover Everest. So yeah, 6 kilometers or 9 kilometers, doesn't matter, the whole flood still gets vaporized. But even though the point still stands, I do prefer to be correct, so I want to acknowledge the mistake here. And yes, I do see the irony of saying that I want to be correct even when it doesn't matter, immediately after saying that I might stop referring to the non-avian dinosaurs as non-avian in order to generate more pedantic corrections in the future. But there is a difference between you could be a bit more specific in a way that won't actually impact anyone's understanding of anything, and you got an actual measurement wrong. Thanks for watching. I'll be back next Friday with more, but if you need to get your Rhino fix in before then, I livestream with Cirrus every Wednesday at 8:30 Eastern on my other channel, The Watering Hole. Thanks to Tim Robertson for being my Patreon and sponsorships manager, and special thanks as always to my patrons, who are the begins to exist that get William Lane Craig out of having to explain the cause of the god that is my channel. If you'd like to somehow not be special pleading despite very obviously being special pleading, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino, or by supporting the channel in one of the other methods that can be found at links.vicerhino.com, which is also where you'll find links to my other projects. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my P.O. Box address is in the description. See you next time!